Tonight on America's Hope, we'll be talking to two people with powerful stories of hope and inspiration. Carrie Sheffield, who grew up in a Mormon home, was exposed to abuse. How did she overcome it? She'll explain why. And then Dr. Ming Wang, who was exposed to communist China and the harsh realities of growing up there. He'll explain how he got a taste of freedom by coming to America. All that tonight on America's Hope, which starts right now. Good evening, I'm Kelly Wright, and this is America's Hope, and I do hope that wherever you are, sincerely, that you are safe and well, taking care of yourself and your family. Why? Because you matter. Speaking of what matters, how do we go from rags to riches? How do we have the resiliency and the strength and the fortitude to move ahead when all odds are against us? Our first guest tonight will show us a lot of that, a lot of grit, a lot of determination, and most notably, a lot of faith. Carrie Sheffield is a columnist and broadcaster in Washington, D.C. She earned a full tuition Harvard scholarship, managed billions of dollars in risk at Wall Street firms, and competed in a Miss USA system beauty pageant. As I mentioned, she's a journalist, and she's also a former White House correspondent, and she challenged, get this, we're going to talk about that as well, she actually challenged the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and has testified as an economic expert before the U.S. Congress. Now, why is Carrie here? Well, you see, despite achieving all of those accomplishments, she had overcome some things, and she writes about it in a new book called Motorhome Prophecies. Carrie, good of you to join us this hour on America's Hope, and I might add to everyone, Carrie is someone that I've known and admired for quite some time. Good to have you on, Carrie.
Kelly, my dear friend, thank you for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure. Look, you overcame a lot of things, psychologically, spiritually, and even sexual abuse. By your own account, you are a recovered agnostic who's practicing faith in God and your foundation in Christian principles. Talk to me about Carrie Sheffield and all that you've accomplished and how you've traveled to every corner of the globe before you even reached 30, by the way.
Yeah, every continent, including Antarctica, which was amazing. So anybody wants to go to Antarctica, Kelly, let me know. I will give you my download on that. But all of those things that you mentioned, I call that's the resume stuff. That's the things that we're proud about, that we cheer about, that we put up on LinkedIn. Well, this book that I wrote, Motorhome Prophecies, a journey of healing and forgiveness, I call this my anti-resume book. So this is the story of the things that I was hiding, the shame that I was feeling, and the things that I hadn't processed correctly to the point where I was allowing my trauma from my upbringing to affect me as an adult and unfortunately make bad choices and allow my emotions to take over and allow my trauma responses to bleed over into my professional life. And so I wrote the book as a letter to my younger self, but also just to people generally, to hopefully give some ideas on how to avoid those mistakes that I made.
And you know, it's a book that I think people will find refreshing. They will also find it illuminating as you expose the vulnerable parts of your life. And so often, Carrie, we're afraid to do that because we're thinking, oh, people will judge us and people will say, oh, you did that and you did this. And yet we have to step across that line into that space of vulnerability and transparency to even find healing in our lives. Is that what you found in writing this?
I did. And the title of the book is called Motorhome Prophecies because I grew up with 7 biological siblings and my parents, all 10 of us, spending a lot of time in a motorhome, traveling across the country. We also lived in houses. We sometimes also lived in sheds. We sometimes lived in tents. My brother was born when the family was living in a tent. And so having 10 people in such a transitory and confined place wouldn't necessarily be bad if you had love and if you had good mental health and good spiritual treatment. Unfortunately, my father, he'll be 86 soon, and he has very severe Alzheimer's, but growing up, He claimed that he would be president of the United States someday, that he had a special prophetic call. And so he basically abused us in the name of God. And so that's why, as you mentioned, I spent a long time, almost 12 years, as an agnostic. When I was doing a lot of these achievements, I had a deep hostility toward God or the idea of God because I was abused in the name of God. Eventually, two of my brothers developed schizophrenia. One of them tried to rape me when I was 17. He groped me. The other accused me of trying to seduce him to have sex with me. And my dad said, yeah, you're a slut and you provoke him. And so it was just a very toxic family environment. And I'm number 5 in the birth order, but I was the first person to leave and the first girl. And because it got so toxic, I told my dad I wanted to leave. And he raised his right hand to the square and he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you'll be raped and murdered if you leave, which is very much something a cult leader would say. And he was, just to be clear, he was excommunicated from the official Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. He was excommunicated from the Mormon Church. He became so extreme in his interpretation of the doctrine. But at that point, when he had that, I believe, false prophecy on my head, I had to make that choice, and I did choose freedom. And so that's when I left, and I got all these career achievements, but I hadn't processed how to forgive him, how to not let the trauma take over my life. And he disowned me. He said my blood changed. I was no longer his daughter. I was not allowed home through college. And so it was a lot. And so I unpack in the book how I did my best, but I failed numerous times. But I quote in the introduction that even though my failures were legendary, the love of God is even more legendary.
Fascinating, and just an incredible story, Carrie. I want to take a break. When we come back, I want to continue talking to you about your book, Motorhome Prophecies, and how you had these incredible breakthroughs and ultimately got to where you are today, a woman of valor and courage and a boldness. Back with more of Carrie Sheffield in just a moment. Welcome back to America's Hope. I'm talking to Carrie Sheffield, and what an incredible story, a life story. Carrie, the fact that you are having this conversation with me, one could arguably say it is miraculous that growing up in the kind of environment that you did, and being exposed to the kind of impediments that you have been exposed to, poverty, psychological, spiritual, and sexual abuse, the fact that you're still standing and even smiling and living a life triumphantly, how'd you overcome those trials?
Well, the long story is in this 90,000 word book, but I would say the short answer is God. But the big picture is that I spent a lot of time chasing after things that I thought would bring me happiness. There's a great book by the late pastor Tim Keller, called The Counterfeit Gods. And each chapter is a counterfeit god, a false idol that we put in place of God. And I was chasing after them: career, dating, relationships, money, prestige, power, politics. And they kept failing me. And so that's really how and why I came back to God, to say, these things are not satisfying me, to make me feel my father hates me, my father disowned me. How do I fill that void, that lack of love in my heart? And that's when I started to come to God, and I was baptized as a Christian on December 3rd, 2017. And through that journey, it didn't happen overnight. I was able to forgive my father for the abuse. It took a lot of reprogramming. They say your brain, it's neuroplastic. It can be molded. It's moldable. But it takes a lot. It didn't happen overnight that I got to the state that I was in, and I didn't get out of it overnight either. 3 of my siblings, unfortunately, they attempted suicide. Thankfully, they were not successful. And over the years, before I got to a healthy, balanced recovery, I contemplated suicide periodically when things went bad, when I got laid off, when I broke off my engagement, when I had trauma with my career and my startup, my business. And so having suicidal ideation based on episodes that are happening in your life, it's a really damaging thing to your cognitive behavior, and the ability to rewrite the code in your brain. I found that through my faith community, through meditation, through studying the Bible, I was able to rewire my brain, and that's why I'm here today in front of you, Kelly.